910, Big 550, KTRS. There was a movie starring Bob Hope and Arnold Palmer that was being broadcast on KPLR 11.2. We interrupt that to bring you a live television broadcast of a live radio show here in St. Louis, STL Today. We should say KPLR channel 11.2, KTRS.com. Back up again. We're a radio station, KTRS Radio, broadcasting on 11.2. That's channel 187 on Charter, and 11.2 if you have an HD antenna. You can also watch us on any device you have at stltoday.com, KTRS.com. We have an app. It's a fantastic app. It works anywhere in the entire world. All you have to do is download it, go to your app store, search KTRS Radio. You probably put in KTR and it shows up automatically, but KTRS Radio. Download that. It's free. And in mere moments, you can be listening anywhere in the world. And, of course, 550 on your AM dial. Lots has been made over Harper Lee and To Kill a Mockingbird recently because it was reported not too long ago, a couple weeks ago, that there was a first version of the book. And the editors said, go back and rewrite it. Harper Lee rewrote it, then published To Kill a Mockingbird, then went on to become one of the greatest books of the 20th century. That's the only book she ever wrote. And subsequently, they're now about to release that first draft of To Kill a Mockingbird. And so lots of people can't wait to see what it was and how it was changed. And our next guest, who we're getting on the line, wrote a New York Times best-selling book called The Mockingbird Next Door, Life with Harper Lee. She traveled to Alabama, met the author, and then began a long friendship with her and wrote the book that is now out in paperback. Do we have her on the line? No, we do not have her on the line. We are getting her on the line right now. Maria Mills wrote that she was a Chicago Tribune reporter, and in 2001, she traveled down to Monroeville to do a story on Harper Lee. And that story became this book. Now, before we have her on the line, To Kill a Mockingbird is one of those books that sort of stays with you your entire life. And everybody has a Boo Radley house. I'm convinced that every town you grow up in, you have a Boo Radley house. And when I read To Kill a Mockingbird, and I read about Boo Radley's house, I had this house in my mind in my hometown. Years later, I was talking to my sisters, and it just sort of came out. I was like, boy, have you seen that Boo Radley house recently? And they said, what Boo Radley house are you talking about? I said, well, the house on the corner that I always equate when I read To Kill a Mockingbird, that was the Boo Radley house. And my three older sisters all looked at me with the weirdest look on their face. And I said, what? And they said, that's the exact house we pictured when we read To Kill a Mockingbird. So that's now considered the Boo Radley house. Do we have you on the line, Maria?
Yes, I love that story.
Say your first name for me.
Maria
Mills. You have written the book, The Mockingbird Next Door, Life with Harper Lee. This book started in 2001?
It did. That's when I was sent to their hometown of Monroeville, Alabama. I was a feature writer at the Chicago Tribune, and the library system had just selected To Kill a Mockingbird for its first ever community read.
Sure.
And I had the good fortune of an editor coming to my desk and saying, want to take a trip. Little did I know where all that would lead.
And so Harper Lee wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. You were charged to go down there and knock on her door and sort of get your foot in the door and get a quote or two?
Well, no, I went down there with no expectation of meeting Nell Harper Lee, as you say, as she's known in her hometown by her full name, or Alice Finchley, her sister, who served as gatekeeper and handled many of her affairs. They were both known to be private, of course, for many years. So we went down really thinking that, nonetheless, that I wouldn't have any expectation of meeting them, but that it would be interesting for readers in Chicago to know more about Monroeville, with the whole city focused on that book. And so it was only near the end of my stay that I got up my courage to knock on their door of this modest red brick house on a quiet street I'd written Alice Lee to let her know I was coming and why. And to my surprise, she answered the door and invited me in for what became the first of many years of conversations with her and her sister about what it meant to live with that phenomenal success, good and bad, I think, what it meant all these years later, and to learn more about their family and their lives.
And it became such a friendship that you moved in next door?
I did, with their blessing. The house next door to theirs was for sale, but not selling. And so with their blessing, I was there for 18 months. I did say when a friend of theirs, suggested a nearby house, might be one I could rent, I did say to the Lee sisters, this might be awfully close for comfort. I won't even inquire if you'd prefer that I look elsewhere. But they encouraged me to, and that proximity ended up really being a gift. One of my favorite things was to pick up my phone in the morning and hear this husky voice saying, "You pourin'?" which was Nell Harper just calling to see if I had a pot of coffee on, and could she come over, and we talk at the kitchen table. You can imagine how enjoyable those were, and she would often drive her sister, who didn't drive at that point but was practicing law right through her 90s. Nell Harper would get behind the wheel of her Buick and just say, "Driving Miss Alice," and she would take her sister to the law firm. Often pick her up at the end of the day. I was in tow some of those times, and we would go feed the ducks and geese after Alice's work day.
The book is called The Mockingbird Next Door, Life with Harper Lee. Maria Mills is our guest. So a couple of questions I'm dying to know, and a couple of questions I never would have the guts to ask her, but I'm going to ask you and see if you had the guts to ask her. And that is, she grew up next door to Truman Capote. So in a small town in Alabama, you have two of the greatest writers of the 20th century, not only in the same town, but in the same, like right next door to each other.
Childhood playmates.
Right. Now, since she wrote only this one book, there are a whole bunch of idiots out there that think either he wrote this book for her or she wrote all of his books for him.
Yeah, and I think, to use an expression she occasionally used, utter nonsense would be the way to describe that. She and her sister both just took umbrage at the thought that Truman Capote had anything to do with that, and I think it's clear if you look at letters and what's known that that's just nonsense. I do think she was helpful to him in the researching of In Cold Blood. He wrote that book, but she was enormously helpful to him when he was trying to get to know the people he needed to know in Kansas to write that book, and was such an outsized personality despite his diminutive stature that I think she was the one who was able to put people at ease around a kitchen table there in Kansas, and to help him a good bit with all of that research. Of course, when I was living next door, there were 2 movies in the works about that time period when she accompanied Truman Capote to Kansas to research those books. In fact, I watched one of them with her, the one in which Catherine Keener plays the role of Nell Harper Lee, and Philip Seymour Hoffman won an Oscar for playing Truman Capote. It is something to think of those 2 imaginations as young children next door, able to play, and they would type up stories on her father's old typewriter he'd brought home from the office, or type up sentences anyway. Alice Lee, being 15 years older, remembered from the perspective of a young adult, young Truman as a boy, when Nell was also just a child, liking to spend time in the Lee household. So much so, he lived with aunts next door. Yeah. So much so that at the end of the day, their father, whom they were terribly fond, would have to say at the end of the day, "Has anyone put Truman out?" he liked to stay underfoot. And those were some of the stories that I think they and their friends knew might be lost because they were in their later years already when I knew them.
Well, they're all
if some of those weren't shared.
They're all in this book, The Mockingbird Next Door: Life with Harper Lee. Maria Mills is our guest and the author. It's in paperback right now. Thank you very much for the time. Too many questions. That's why we have to read the book. Thanks for checking in.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
You got it. 9:20 here at Big 550 KTRS. So much more to get to in terms of why did she only write one book? And it was such a great story. Were there no other stories out there? Why did she just write the one book and then never write again? And now what she thinks about this new book coming out. Anyway, that's why it's in the book. The book is called The Mockingbird Next Door: Life with Harper Lee. Maria Mills is our guest. 9:20 here, Big 550.